Welcome to the Geospatial Forum, the first one of this series for fall. So a big thanks to Ross and a big thanks to John, graduate students, all the others that make this possible. A really exciting seminar series. So today we're going to welcome Mark Friedl from Boston University, where he's a professor in the Department of Earth and Environment. He is one of the leading remote sensing scientists in the world, responsible for approaching 100 refereed journal articles, 47 counting extramurally funded projects. He came to, before BU, he got his PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara, so right there on the beach. It's a really nice place to study. So particularly if you're interested in remote sensing, it's a great place to be.
Go Gauchos.
What's that?
Go Gauchos.
So in Mark's very distinguished career, he's worn many hats, been the chair of the department. He's been served on the MODIS and Landsat VIIRS science team, continues in many of those capacities, been associate editor of some of the leading journals like Remote Sensing Environment, AVHRR, Geosciences, among many, many others. Someone of this caliber has a CV way too long to list every accolade here, but suffice to say, we are very lucky to have him here. I'm personally very lucky that he took a chance and took me as his postdoc many years ago, and he continues to be a big influence on my career, and but don't hold that against him. Most of his decisions are bad. So today he's going to talk about changes in temperate and boreal forests, or as I say, Boreal forests, based on 3 decades of Landsat imagery. And I think this is a great opportunity for all of us to learn a little bit about how we can apply really big remote sensing data sets to real ecological problems and at very large scales. So thanks, Mark.
All right. Thank you, Josh. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. Thank you, Ross, for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. It's actually my second time in North Carolina, so every time I come down, I think, boy, what a nice place. So as Josh says, I'm a prof at BU. I'm a Red Sox fan. Apparently you can't escape Yankees fans wherever you go. Josh and I were actually at a meeting in Sweden, and there were people with Yankees caps everywhere. So it's okay. We're up by 8.5 games. I don't know, whatever. But what's that?
Who's counting? Who's
counting? That's right. Well, you know, it's been a good year. So yeah, just before I get started here, I do want to acknowledge the fact that the work I present is basically mostly done by other people. So former PhD student postdoc Damien Suleymanasci, colleague at BU Eli Malas, Josh has contributed to some of this work, and basically a pretty large team. So please stop me. I understand it's a pretty diverse crowd, so please stop me if you've got questions. It's fine. I know that frequently I will, ramble on for quite a while, not realizing that people have no idea what I'm talking about. It's totally fine to just interrupt me for clarification. So, and I understand it's kind of a broad audience here. So just to get things started here, here's a plot that I'm assuming most of us have seen before, this sort of famous Keeling curve collected at Mauna Loa. I guess the laser pointer doesn't actually work on the screen. No, that's okay. And so, what a lot of people worry about is this notion that obviously atmospheric CO2 is increasing. We've gone from 270 parts per million pre-industrial when they started measuring in 1960, 310, 315. We're now up above over 400. That's what a lot of people are concerned about in terms of the Earth's greenhouse, right? But what I'd like to focus on is something that people think about less, which is this sawtooth pattern, which is basically the signature of the terrestrial biosphere, particularly the northern hemisphere terrestrial biosphere, where all the land, or most of the landmass, and 2/3 of the landmass on the planet is, and by extension 2/3 of the vegetation. And basically what you're seeing here is what some people variously call the lungs of the planet. Spring happens, leaves emerge, CO2 gets pulled down. It's a pretty impressive signature of biospheric activity on the planet. In fact, if you zoom in, you can see a couple of other things. Here's Barrow. So if you look at the previous slide, I think the amplitude was on order 7-8 parts per million. If you look at, here's Barrow, which is like at 70 degrees north, I'm going to guess, right? You can see here's the same thing. This is also near the surface, Mauna Loa, where they collect those measurements. They chose that site for a reason, right? In the middle of the Pacific, 12,000 feet above the surface, roughly in the well-mixed atmosphere away from sources. Here's Barrow near the surface, much further north, and you can see the amplitude is on order 15 to 20, so nearly twice as large, right? Which is reflecting the fact it's further north in the northern hemisphere. Here's in American Samoa, a flux light, you don't see any amplitude, which reflects the fact that you're near the equator. I think it's at like 13 degrees south or something like that. In the tropics, much less seasonal amplitude. So the main point here is what we're seeing here is the northern hemisphere, sort of the lungs of the planet, breathing, and it's a remarkable signature of biospheric activity. So Josh can tell you that I've been sort of obsessed with this one piece of work that showed up about 5 years ago now in Science. So at some point I'm going to have to stop talking about this. But to me this was a really remarkable study if you're interested in kind of global change science. Truly, for me, one of the most interesting papers I've seen maybe in my entire career. So let me lay this out a little bit for you because it's kind of a complicated plot. So what we're looking at here is lower atmosphere, 700 millibars, so that's probably about 3 kilometers above the surface, 500 millibars, about 6 kilometers above the surface. The black dots and lines are from about measurements that were collected about 50 years ago. January, April, June, October, so over the course of a season and at different latitudes. All right, and so basically, and these are collected from aircraft, and basically what they did was these pole-to-pole measurements from North Pole to the South Pole back, and the aircraft would go up and down and up and down in the atmosphere, right, sampling atmospheric concentrations of CO2 as a function of latitude, as a function of time. All right, so what should you be seeing from this? What's the take-home message? The take-home message is if you compare what they measured at 500 millibars or 700 millibars in the atmosphere across latitudes, across time, what you can see is that the pink lines are, the amplitude is larger than the black lines, right? And that increases as you go to higher latitudes. All right, so over the course of 50 years, as you go from, let's just take 65 degrees north, that amplitude, let's just go back, this sawtooth pattern, which you can't see in this plot, has actually increased from about, 8 parts per million per year over the course of a year to about 14. So that amplitude has increased by nearly double over 50 years. All right, which to me is this remarkable empirical signature of how the global biosphere is changing, right? We are seeing there's only one way that this happens, and that's because vegetation is changing, productivity is changing, respiration is changing in response to a changing climate, all right? And so, it's just a beautiful empirical scientific result that demonstrates how profoundly, I guess profound is in the eyes of the beholder, but to me, profoundly the planet has changed and the ecology of the planet over the last 50 years. All right, and so Inez Feng, who's a prominent atmospheric chemist, wrote a companion piece in Science magazine to this particular article that described this process as the planet starting to hyperventilate in response to climate change, right? The biosphere vegetation starting to really sort of accelerate in terms of its productivity. And so, Josh actually, this is work that Josh did. I'm just going to do a couple of slides on this because it sort of sets things up a little bit for the rest I want to talk about. Kind of posed this question, well, is the biosphere hyperventilating or is it actually on steroids? All right, so what do I mean by this? If you actually look at the planet, so here's a map of global agriculture. This is the red areas where we have the most intense agriculture. And you can see, for those of you that know anything about, for example, the Green Revolution, we know that, do you guys want to try and slide in a little bit? All right. That we have enormously increased the productivity of agricultural lands on the planet. All right. And so the challenge with Graben's work is they presented this result, but they didn't really attribute it to, and they couldn't really say where it was coming from. All right, so Josh posed this question. Well, we've actually really changed the way we do agriculture on the planet in this same period, so maybe this is part of the explanation. So this is really quickly, I'm going to do this quickly because I've got too many slides anyway. But what we're looking at here is by latitude, change in, Josh collected all this sort of agricultural productivity information, which is among the best kept records on the planet, right? There's very few systems for which we keep this type of data, but crop yields are one of them. This is maize, wheat, rice, soybeans, and then all 4 crops together, which is about 80%, I'd say, roughly, of calories on the planet. As a function of latitude, the dashed line is 50 years ago, the solid line is contemporary. And you can see how much productivity has increased, right, and in the northern mid-latitudes, right? So we've doubled to tripled crop production during that period. And so what Josh was able to show is you can map that. Here's the changes. So I tried to get Josh not to use a polar projection, but I lost that battle. So and he's here to prove it. It's okay. We got the paper published. And you can see this is change in production, and then through a bunch of pretty sophisticated modeling that Josh did, you could actually convert that into the amount of CO2 that's being pulled out of the atmosphere, the change in the amount of CO2 that's being pulled out of the atmosphere as a byproduct of those changes in productivity. And sort of getting straight to the punchline, we went from, in about 1960, about 2 petabytes, so petabytes, billions of, petagrams, sorry, my brain's stuck in computers, petagrams, that's a lot of carbon, up to about 8 petagrams, so 4 times increase. And if we actually look at that, some of the really interesting parts of that is by crop, about 2/3 of that from a single crop. I don't know how much you guys have spent in the Midwestern United States these days, but if you go out there this time of year, the cornfields are the corn plants are 12 feet high, 10 feet high, and they're this far apart. It's just amazing what we have engineered, we being society, in terms of the agricultural production on the planet, right? Most of which, by the way, is going to feed cows, pigs, and ethanol for cars, and corn syrup for your diet sodas, right? Very little of which gets consumed by it. But anyway, 2/3 of that for maize, and then I think, what was it, 88%? Yeah, 88% in 2 places, Midwestern United States and China, all right? So back of envelope, bottom line, of that really profound change I was describing before in terms of the seasonality of CO2, Josh figured that it was about 20 to 25% explained just by agriculture, which is pretty amazing because it's only, I think, 6 or 8% of the landscape on the planet producing this change. And most of that from 2 fairly restricted regions, and 2/3 of that from just changes in productivity of corn. Okay, so a pretty interesting story surrounding around how humans have actually changed the productivity of a managed ecosystem in a way that's actually then changing the actual chemistry of the atmosphere in a way that's kind of profound. All right, so that's all well and good, but what about the other 75 to 80%? And so the next question is, well, then we've eliminated agriculture, so that must be changes in natural ecosystems on the planet. Okay, and so what I want to spend most of my time talking about today is how we use satellites, Earth observation satellites, which have been in orbit for, well, depending on which satellite you're talking about, the ones that I'm going to be talking about, we're now going on 30, 40 years of observations during this period of kind of profound change on the planet. And so, what I want to talk about is a variety of sort of different studies we've done over the last 3, 4, or 5 years, talking about focusing on North American temperate and boreal forests, partly because we know them best, partly because that's where the data is deepest. And so one of the things that I've spent a lot of time in my career working on is an instrument called MODIS. MODIS is the Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer. This was an instrument initially launched, there's two of them, in about 2000, right? And for the last 2 decades, it's kind of been NASA's flagship global change instrument. It's a really beautiful instrument. It images the planet. There's now 2 of them. So what this image is showing, here's an artist rendering. This is the swath every day, so it images everywhere on the planet daily, poleward of 30 degrees. And at the tropics, there are these little, in the tropics, there are these gaps, but it's pretty frequent. And because there's 2 of them, you're imaging basically the whole planet twice a day, continuously. Really, really well-calibrated, high-precision instrument. They actually, periodically, I think this is kind of cool if you're kind of a NASA geek, they roll the spacecraft periodically to point the instrument at the moon so that they can see this so they have a stable calibration target, so they can just make sure that the instrument's not drifting and all this kind of stuff. It's a pretty amazing data set, right? So the challenge here, though, is that it's, in terms of a global change instrument, even though we now have 18 years of data, it's still kind of a short time scale, right? It's hard to talk about things that are slowly varying, but changes in the aggregate that are changing slowly with a lot of variation embedded in it, right? Weather and climate is pretty variable from year to year. And so I think of it more as MODIS as being well suited for analysis of sort of extreme events. So for example, here's some work we did. In 2010 in the northeastern United States, we had this incredibly warm spring, which at the time we thought was the most unusual event we'd had. And in fact, so here's data from the National Climate Data Center showing the ranks of springtime temperatures by state. And for the whole, at that time, for 116 years record, it was the warmest spring on record. And then in 2012, which is kind of a harbinger of what's going on in the planet, right? Every time we think we've had an unusual event, something more extreme seems to be happening. And so this is what happened in 2012, exact same thing. And you can see all these red states, warmest spring on record, right? And then so this is a little bit hard to explain, but GDD is growing degree days. So basically how warm it is, excuse me, and this is an anomaly. So this is a change, a delta from average conditions. This is SOS, is the timing for the start of spring. And so this is from the MODIS record. These are different years. And so what you can basically see here is it's hard based on, at that time it was 14 years worth of data or 12 years worth of data to build too much of in terms of a trend line here. But basically what you can see is we can see a clear record in the satellite record of warmer springs, warmer temperatures, earlier springs, cooler springs, later leaf emergence, right? So we're measuring leaf emergence here, the timing of leaf emergence. So it's basically 25 days difference in terms of the timing of spring between these events. So it's a pretty big difference. And so a follow-on study to work that we did was to look at the overall trend, again, based on MODIS, in terms of the timing of spring. So what this plot is showing you is -1, these dark green areas, would be areas that over the MODIS record showing that on average spring is getting earlier by 1 day per year. And then these red areas, which are not very common, would be getting later. I actually, part of me kind of regrets agreeing to publish this result because I think they're exaggerated, quite candidly. We're not seeing a change in the timing of leaf emergence in eastern temperate forests of 1 day per year, not even close. But there's strong evidence that, maybe 7 days, 5 days over the course of 1 or 2 decades, it's pretty clear. And the implication here is, so these are data from what are called flux towers, right, in terms of when the carbon uptake period starts among these flux towers. And that is, and these are different towers, some of them have shorter records. This one is the Harvard Forest Tower, which has the longest record, measurement record on the planet, that they're all heading towards, the slope here is all like this, meaning they're all starting, there's strong evidence that ecosystems are starting to absorb carbon earlier and earlier with every passing year, the implication being that more carbon is being absorbed from the atmosphere by terrestrial ecosystems. And why does this matter? Just for context, of all the CO2 we're pumping into the atmosphere from anthropogenic sources right now, terrestrial ecosystems are absorbing about 50% of that. Okay, so this actually matters a lot, whether or not ecosystems continue to do this. So MODIS starts in 2000. One thing that another instrument, AVHRR, the Advanced Very High Resolution Radiometer, is actually an older instrument that was designed to look at clouds, but just happens to be able to look at land surfaces as well. Not very well, I would argue, but there's been a variety of work because it starts earlier in 1984, that's a much longer record, and so then you can start to look at trends and real changes over multiple decades. And so Scott Getz published a paper in PNAS back in 2005. These are kind of hard to see, but the simple term is, I don't know why he picked these colors. It's really bad color choice. But blue areas, browning, so it's becoming less green. These yellow areas, greening up, becoming more green. All right. So one of the big implications of this is that warming on the planet is leading to stress, particularly in these boreal forests. They don't like it being warmer. They don't like it being drier. Decreasing productivity, which has, the boreal forest is the largest continuous forest on the planet. It's a big part of that sort of northern hemisphere productivity story I was talking about earlier. And so if there is some concern in the literature that with warming that these forests might actually collapse, right? Which would have a profound impact on the global carbon budget and by extension on the climate system. Here's another analysis. It's a little bit cleaner on a more recent reprocessing of this data set that we did internally at BU, and you see the exact same pattern. Browning, i.e. it looks like it's getting less green across the boreal forest. Above the tree line, looks like it's getting more green. All right? So what we've sort of been working on in my group is taking this basic question, what is happening to these forests, and saying there's a lot of work that's been done using this instrument called AVHRR, which candidly is a crappy instrument. It was never designed to do this type of analysis. And we said, well, there is actually another instrument, this thing called Landsat, which is much higher spatial resolution, has beautiful radiometry, is really well calibrated, and in the past has been hard to use for these type of problems just because of the data volumes, right? It's an enormous amount of data to process. But we now have these cloud compute facilities that allow us to push these sort of data volumes around. So let's try and ask the same questions using these data sets, which are much, much higher quality. Okay, so basically, the questions we're asking here is, what does the Landsat record tell us about changes in the productivity, the phenology, and the land cover of these forests? How are these systems changing? Okay, at large scale. So I won't go into this in a lot of detail. Basically what we set up, we didn't do wall-to-wall processing for a couple of reasons. One is the data volumes. The other is that we exploited a particularly distinct feature of, it's not distinct to Landsat, but it is a property of the Landsat data, which is that it's what's called a polar orbiting satellite. So the orbits go close to the poles every time, which means that I'm really bad at these sort of 3D views. The orbits converge as you go towards the poles. All right, and so if you can imagine, what happens is you've got, my hand is an image, right? As you go towards the poles, the images overlap, the scenes overlap, and so what that means is these blue zones are the overlap zones between adjacent orbits. And so in these zones, you get denser and denser sets of observations. So you get more observations in these overlap zones, and so that helps us. More observations is better. So we strategically sampled these for a variety of different criteria. Our idea was to cover the entire boreal eastern temperate forest, and we selected them based on a stratified random sample within these ecoregions, right, so that we're getting good geographic coverage. We sampled based on tree cover, and then we selectively identified locations where there's ground data so we could compare our results against those guys. So it's what I call kind of a pseudo-random design. Okay, so the sort of the second question here is, so the first question was, in terms of a hyperventilating planet, is it hyperventilation or is it steroids? The answer was kind of both. The second question is, addressing this question, are boreal forests actually greening or browning? Right? Is there this notion that climate change is introducing stress into boreal forests to the point where they may actually be starting to die off? Okay? So we took about 46 sites out of our total of 80, distributed across just the boreal forest, and we tried to ask this question. Now, the key here, one of the keys here is that these are really subtle signals we're trying to measure from space. And it's important to measure, we're measuring these things from 700 kilometers above the planet, right? These are indirect measurements. And so, there's multiple Landsat instruments that are collecting these data. So before we did anything, we tried to do a very careful analysis of the character and quality, right? So I'm going to actually, for the sake of time, I'm going to, can I do this? Yes, I can. We did a lot of pre-processing. Anything happening here? All right. Conversion from Mac to PC did not work. That's okay. We did a lot of pre-processing to clean up the data to get it there. You got to remove the atmosphere. You got to remove clouds. We looked at, so if you know anything about boreal forests, they like to burn, right? There's a lot of fire and disturbance and insect disturbance. So we had to account for that. And then what we did was we took, for each year, we took the maximum NDVI. All right, so NDVI is a common satellite index, which basically tells you how green the ground is, right? So then what we have is a time series that's cleaned up where we've got the maximum greenness value at each pixel in each year. And the first thing we did was to see, well, are these instruments actually stable? Can we actually look at subtle changes over time? All right, so here's the individual bands, right? Because Landsat's measuring in different wavelength regions. When we compute these these greenness indices, like what we call an NDVI, it's a combination of the red band and the near-infrared band. What I'm showing you here is measurements over stable targets of data collected between 1985 and 1989 and between 2005 and 2009. So 20 years apart, and all we're asking here is, are these instruments sufficiently well calibrated so there's no drift over time that might be introducing artifacts into a time series analysis? And what you can see here is it's pretty rock solid. Red band in particular, and I should say this is for the Landsat 5 thematic mapper, okay, which is just one instrument, right? And you combine those into what's called an NDVI, normalized difference vegetation index, or an EVI, different band combinations. Don't worry about the details. Basically what we're seeing is over time, very stable instrument, which gives us confidence that we can actually apply time series analysis. We did a few other things. I'm not going to go into the details. There are subtle geometric effects in these imagery, right? So this is so if you're looking at two images that sit, and we're looking at this zone in the overlap between images, you've got some that are on the eastern side versus some that are on the western side of the imagery. If you look at that, there's a slight directional effect. So if you compare eastern viewing versus western viewing, see a slight bias. Good news, if you're using NDVI, those effects cancel. That's good. EVI, you got to be a little more careful. And then the last thing here is comparing the two instruments. So there's a thematic mapper 5 versus the enhanced thematic mapper. This was on Landsat 5. This was on Landsat 7. Landsat 6, for those of you who are wondering what happened to Landsat 6, failed at launch. The sort of dark humor in the community is it became an oceanographic instrument because it landed in the ocean, in the Indian Ocean. So there was no Landsat 6. But if we compare measurements in the red band for the same targets in the ETM on Landsat 7 versus Landsat 5, they're different. Okay? Particularly in the darker targets over the red band, so slightly different. And what that means is that when you compute these greenness indices like the NDVI from ETM on Landsat 7 versus TM5 on Landsat 5, you get a higher value, which is problematic when you're doing time series because this guy was launched at the end of the time series for relative to the Landsat 5, and so if you're just taking a time series of NDVI measurements and then you're adding it this other instrument on the end, it's going to be higher, which means you'll get a trend where you shouldn't have one. It's just a bias instrument introduced by the instrument. So we had to correct for that as well. Anyway, so too many sort of nitty-gritty details here. Let me just get to results. So here's what we did, folks. We took all these sites, right, and then we broke them up in a couple of different ways. We looked at disturbed sites, places where there have been fires and insects, versus undisturbed sites. And we broke them up into deciduous broadleaf versus evergreen needleleaf forest. This is all in the boreal forest. And then we looked at how NDVI has changed over the 30-year record. Okay? And basically the short story here is we break it out by when the disturbance happened. So for undisturbed or things that were disturbed a long time ago, we basically don't see much change. All right? And the key thing here is that this is a different story from what a fairly large literature is showing, suggesting that there's big changes happening in the boreal forest. As you go to sites that were disturbed between 1970 and 1980, we actually see increasing greenness. As we go to sites that were disturbed between 1980 and 1990, even stronger greening. All right? So in simple terms, what this is saying is, if you go back, sorry you guys, to this type of a story, all this browning or substantial, what this implies is a substantial proportion of this quote-unquote browning that's been going on is not actually decreases in productivity or stress imposed by a changing climate. It's just a signature of disturbance and fire, which is very common up there, which you can't really separate out from this instrument. You can't see it, and that's one of the advantages of Landsat. You actually can see it in the Landsat record, which is a pretty important result because there's a lot of high-profile papers saying that boreal forests may be about to move into a new mode and perhaps collapse. So that was one thing. The other thing we did was, so then we wanted to ask the question, well, seeing as we can separate out forests that have been disturbed from those that haven't been disturbed, can we just look at the undisturbed forests because those are the ones that will actually provide sentinels of some kind of signature for change, right? Because there's no fire signature in there. These are just forests that have been there stable the whole time. And if we do that, so I should have put in a graphic here. Actually, I can go back. Sorry, you guys. Right? So this is broken out by these ecoregions. This is what these different colors are. So roughly, this is from east to west. Right? And so what we see here is you go kind of from east to west here, we actually see some greening in the eastern boreal forests. Most of the center we see pretty neutral. The one place where we see a little bit of browning is in the western taiga forests. Okay? And so we can kind of put this together. Any biogeographers in the crowd here? Whitaker plots? You guys know Whitaker plots? It's famous. This is sort of one of the most famous biogeographers decades ago. This guy named Whitaker generated these things. So what I'm showing you here is this is a plot that maps out where different biomes, different forest types in this case exist as a function of mean annual climate. Average precipitation, dry, wet, average temperature, warm, cool, right? So tundra's up here, temperate forests down here, deserts over here, temperate forests over here, all right? And on top of this, what I'm showing you is for each of the sites that we looked at, whether things were greening up or getting browner, right? And so what you can see here, I mean, this is completely consistent with sort of ecological biogeographic theory, which is that in places which are cooler but relatively mesic, so not water limited, it's warming up, they're getting greener. These are this is the eastern boreal forest. In places in the west, which are kind of on that ecotone between forests and woodlands, right, or grasslands, they're already stressed, it's warming up a little bit, and so they're browning down a little bit. And that's where your signature is. All right, so bottom line here, we don't find a lot of evidence for greening and browning, and particularly in undisturbed forests. What we do see is greening in the eastern forest, which is completely consistent with what you'd expect, and modest browning in these places that are already water stressed, and so on. All right, so that was, is greening and browning happening? The second question was, is the growing season changing? All right, and so I'm not going to go into details. We've basically, Eli Malas at BU has developed this algorithm where for any given location, we stack all the data, all the time series across all years. So this is day of year. Here's enhanced vegetation index, which I already talked about. We fit a simple function to fit the average seasonality at that location. And then for any given year, we can identify the timing of spring based on the deviation from the mean, and likewise for the fall. Okay, so what we did was we took this technique and we applied it across all these sites. Here's a map. This is southwestern North Carolina up in here. Coweta is up in here, down into Georgia down here. So you can see what I'm showing you is a map. So you got to get used to this sort of notation here for the average day of year that we see green up, leaf emergence from the satellites. All right, and so you can see in the south, day of year 105, so early April. You go a little bit further north, higher elevations about a month later. Okay. The first thing we did here, a little bit akin to what we did with with the previous analysis, where we were looking at the calibration stability. Here we're interested in, does this actually reproduce reality in any way, shape, or form, right? So here are the 14 sites that we selectively chose where there's actually ground observations, and we did a fairly careful analysis to see how well the data held up. Here's some quick results. I won't go into the details. These are from eddy covariant sites, which are basically measuring how much photosynthesis is happening. And so we said, when does photosynthesis turn on in the spring based on these sites? And we compared that against what we're seeing from the satellites. Here's Landsat start of season. Here's Landsat end of season. These are for needle leaf forests. So pretty good correlation, but we're detecting it late from satellites. Conifers turn on early, not necessarily before they do leaf flushing. No signal in the fall. We can't do it. And then here the deciduous broadleaf sites works great in deciduous broadleaf sites. Fall okay, but a little bit harder. Here's another set of data. I work quite closely with colleague Josh has worked on some of this too. He now has about 300 to 400 phenocams. These are tower-mounted cameras where we can generate these time series of greenness from the cameras, and then we compare the timing of the spring and the timing of the fall from those cameras against what we see from the satellite records. Same kind of result. Springtime, great. Fall, particularly depending on what kind of metric you use from the satellite and from the ground data, it's kind of harder to do. So bottom line, we can do spring really well. Fall, we're still figuring out. So I'm just going to talk about spring from here on in. Okay, so So we took this algorithm, we applied it to the whole satellite record. And so what I'm showing you here is, for each of the sites in this database we created, just as a sanity check, here's the mean day of year on which spring leaves emerged based on that record. And it goes from about day of year 90, again, so April 1st in the south up to day of year 180, July 1st in the north. So sanity check, so far so good. Here's the trend. All right, so now that we've done this at each of these sites, there's mean, and then we can do it for each year. And so if we look at the trend, what we can see is kind of an interesting story where, particularly throughout the eastern temperate forest, we're seeing a trend of about quarter of a day per year, or 2.5 days per decade. So for every decade, on average, over those 3 decades, we're getting about 2.5 days earlier, or about a week over the 30-day record. So what we're seeing from Landsat is pretty much uniformly throughout the eastern forests, over the 30-year record, on average, with a lot of variability, spring is moved about a week earlier, pretty consistently. Interestingly, out in the western boreal forests, it's actually showing us, on average, a little bit later. So delayed springs, and I'll come back to that later. The other interesting thing is to actually aggregate this a little bit. So what I'm showing you here is the timing based on, I don't know whether you guys can see this, but there are these ecoregions, level 2 EPA ecoregions. So we aggregate over that. If you look at the annual time series and estimate trends, here's taiga forests, trend towards earlier spring. Here are these northern forests, basically the boreal forest, where we're not actually seeing that much, and even some trend toward later springs. And then here are the eastern temperate forests, exact same thing, but you can see that strong signal towards earlier springs there, right? It's hard to get, we can see the statistical significance on these guys. It's hard to get statistical significance on a short time series, particularly one that's as noisy as this, right? But the interesting part to me, in some sense, the most interesting part to me, is how much variability you see from year to year, right? Which is reflecting and capturing variability in the weather and climate system. So, Mid-Atlantic close to home here, Mid-Atlantic coastal plain, southeastern coastal plain, we're seeing 25, 30 days difference in the timing of spring over the record. Okay? So, taking this one step further, you can actually correlate the timing or the anomalies in how warm it is. This is an anomaly in growing degree days, how warm it is in the spring versus the anomalies in the timing of the spring. And basically what we can see is these really, really strong agreements. So warmer years, earlier springs, warmer years, earlier springs, cooler years, later springs. Holds up really, really well. So this is basically demonstrating to us that even though some of these guys, very few of these guys are actually showing statistically significant trends, we are absolutely capturing the sensitivity in the timing of spring to year variability in the climate system. All right, so we can quantify that. And what you can see here is, again, here's the sensitivity. It's about a week or 10 days change in the timing of spring for every change of 100 growing degree days in the climate. So you warm things up, spring is going to come earlier, and then here's the actual trends in temperature. All right, so these redder areas are warming up by anywhere from 2 to 8 growing degree days per year, and these blue areas are actually getting cooler, right, based on the instrumental record. So what this is explaining why, if you recall from my earlier slides, some of these sites in the west were actually showing later springs. That's actually consistent with the temperature record here, where springtime temperatures, despite an overall warming trend, have actually cooled down a little bit. All right, last thing, 5 more minutes and I'm done, you guys. Thank you for hanging in here, okay? So then the last question, so we've talked about steroids or hyperventilating. We've talked about greening and browning. We've talked about is the growing season changing. The last thing is the distribution of PFTs or plant functional types changing in boreal and Arctic regions. So this is work that we've been doing for a NASA project called ABOVE, which is the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, where they're basically identified this. This is Alaska up here, Northwest Territories, Yukon, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia. It's about, I'm going to say 4.5 million square kilometers. It's a big chunk of landscape. What we've been doing is we've been trying to take this Landsat time series and then map the plant functional types and how they're changing over time. All right? So here's, you can't really see it here. Here's 1984. We've mapped it every year at 30 meter spatial resolution. Here it is 30 years later in 2013. You can't really see, it doesn't really show up that well because it's subtle. But if we just map the changes, you can see it's pretty widespread. Okay? Which is mostly, by the way, a lot of this, some of it's logging, a lot of it's just fire disturbance and this kind of stuff. All right, so this red, and in particular, I'll show you this in a second, this red stuff is loss of evergreen needle-leaf forests. All right, so we can characterize and we can quantify over a pretty large chunk of real estate how these sort of dominant plant functional types in boreal and Arctic systems are changing. And we can, oh, here's a zoom in just to get you guys see. So here's a tile up near Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, for scale. That's about 180 kilometers across. There's a big set of fires here in the sort of early 1990s. Doesn't show up all that great, but if I toggle back and forth, you can see that's all fire. These are systems that like to burn a lot. And sort of one of the implications here, here's the change, is accelerating fire regimes, accelerating disturbance regimes in response to climate warming is actually leading to pretty widespread changes in the land cover. All right? So, you know, we can do things for like this zone. Here's time. Here are the major land cover types. You can see here's the fire, right? We lose a whole bunch of woodlands. So forested area, but pretty sparse forests. I don't know how many of you guys have spent time in boreal forests, but they do not look like the loblolly pines we have out here. They look more like a forest of Charlie Brown Christmas trees, or kind of sad little trees living in these sort of really hostile environments. That goes away, gets replaced by barren, which then starts, you start a whole successional process, right? And so the question is, these changes in these disturbance regimes, how have they changed the overall composition and by extension the productivity and ecological function of these regimes? And so what we're seeing here, these are really early results, is the big thing is here's conifer forests, which are the dominant cover type in boreal forests. By our estimation, in that region, which is sort of the western half of the boreal forest in North America, has lost about 110,000 square kilometers of conifer forest. All right, so for reference, that's about 3/4 of the size of the state of North Carolina. Right, so imagine you take all the trees in North Carolina, and and there's a lot of trees in North Carolina, right, you guys? And that's the scale at which, over a large area, this type of change has happened. So we've lost tree cover, we've lost barren cover, we're increasing deciduous forests, we're increasing shrubs, we're increasing herbaceous cover. Preliminary results, but that's what we think we're seeing. All right, so summary and conclusions. One is biosphere is changing. I think we've got a long way to go to understand exactly how it's changing, but a lot's changing, particularly at high latitudes where a lot of the warming is particularly amplified. In terms of our own results, we see greening in eastern boreal forests, a little bit of browning, but not a lot, certainly not what a lot of the literature has suggested. We're just absolutely seeing changes in the growing season. We believe there are sort of corresponding changes at the end of the season, but we want to be a little bit conservative before we go too far down that road, so we need to be a little bit more certain about that. And we also finally see what I characterize here as emerging evidence of trends in the actual composition of plant functional types at high latitudes. We are switching out major life forms for other life forms at what could emerge to be a pretty large scale change in these ecosystems. That's very preliminary, but we think that's what we're seeing. Okay? And still, as always, lots to figure out. So I will stop there. Thanks for your attention. Happy to answer questions. Even from Yankee fans. Yeah.
So what's the trouble with fall? Because I know there's some concern that if trees start this season earlier, that especially drought-sensitive trees may run out of water.
Yep.
By the fall.
What's the problem in measuring it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one way to answer that is that in the spring, it's a much stronger signal. It's a much more distinct signal, so it's easier to measure from space. In the fall, senescence, I don't really have a good answer for you, but this is what I'm thinking. It's a much more sort of stochastic, gradual, and subtle signal, which is compounded by senescence and leaf fall, right? Which is kind of punctual events with storms come through and the leaves come down. So it's just not as strong and distinct a signal to measure. And we may be using the wrong types of metrics and the wrong types of models to do it. We've been trying to use the same approach used in spring, which is kind of a strong, particularly some year, the leaves just pop, right? And I think we may have to try and use, one of the things we've had success with is, for example, instead of using measures of greenness, we look for color, like redness and yellowness. But that's not going to work everywhere. So, it's just a harder, more complex, more subtle signal that's more gradual and less punctual. So we're working on it. Yeah.
So tracking Landsat 9 goes up in 2020.
December, currently scheduled for December 2020, yeah.
Is there anything important on that mission that's going to improve your research in particular?
Continuity. I mean, it's the same instrument, right? It's OLI2 and it's the TIRS 2. They're identical instruments. I think that so continuity is one thing, and the OLI is definitely a better instrument than the enhanced thematic mapper. It's a nice instrument, and then I guess the other subtle thing would be just having two OLIs in space, right? Because they're not going to take Landsat 8 down. They'll leave it up, and so you'll have more observations and more density. And so between that and the Sentinel-2 that's up now, it's going to be more data than we've ever had before. Sure. Yeah, Nick.
So in the last set of slides you showed, there was a big loss of barren lands. Is that lands that were barren due to disturbance? Is that lands that are becoming productive because of warming? Do you know why you're seeing such a big loss?
Yeah, I think the main thing is, let's see if I can go. So if you go, it's a little bit, so if you look up, like, I'm Canadian, I should know this. I think one of these two is Ellesmere Island. I can't remember which one, but if you sort of toggle back and forth, so I think what you're seeing is, people call it shrubification. It's expansion of vegetation at high latitudes in places where just previously there was no growing seasonal. It's warming up, woody shrubs and herbaceous cover is expanding. So I don't want to say that definitively because we have to look at it more closely, but it's very clear that above the tree line, you can see, that's unequivocal, that things are greening up and changing, and there's plenty of evidence that woody shrubs are expanding quite rapidly up there, and so I would expect a lot of that in sort of these tundra zones, but I would expect the same things to be happening at high latitudes with respect to some of these areas that were previously just unvegetated or had very little vegetation. So it's changing. Planet is changing, people. Better get used to it. Yeah.
Can you use Landsat for albedo?
People are, yeah.
Getting products like Modus products that?
So Crystal Schaff at the University of Massachusetts is building an albedo product from Landsat. I think she's also funded to do the same thing, they call it pan-boreal, but I think it's everywhere north of 45 degrees based on a combination of Landsat and Sentinel. So yeah, I mean, it's harder to do, right? Because with MODIS, you've got the spectral information and the angular information, not the spectral information. So you can build those types of models more effectively. But what Crystal is doing is she's basically taking the sort of the base BRD, the angular information from MODIS, and trying to extrapolate that to Landsat. So yeah.
The reason I'm interested is because, you know, in the GCM world, boreal forests are warming agents, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And,
that's right.
A lot of that has to do with, in my opinion, the conceptual model behind albedo and snow.
Right.
And canopy.
Yep.
And persistence.
Yep.
And there's just not a lot of, if you look at the MODIS record, there's just not a lot of good winter imagery to document
changes.
some of those model assumptions.
Yeah, yeah.
And so what happens when, you know, you describe the boreal forest well. That doesn't suggest that differences in snow-free and snow-covered albedo and boreal forests are going to be as dramatic as they're represented.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's one of the questions. That's one of the. I mean,
Data to be collected there.
Yeah, no, I think Crystal's working on that, and you know, I spent most of my time sort of emphasizing the kind of the carbon implications. But yeah, I mean, boreal forests are dark, right? And so there's a secondary or primary effect that if you change that cover type, the albedo changes, which is a substantial radiative effect.
They're also pretty open.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
the shadowing with and without snow
Yeah.
is, it's not clear to me that that's conceptualized right.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I mean, that's not my field, but I think that there's a lot of things that are not well understood. And I think, candidly, that's one of the reasons why, you know, for this ABOVE project, that's why NASA, I mean, NASA, I can't remember who I was talking to, but NASA does these sort of periodic field experiments, so ABOVE is their current one, and it's effectively a 10-year program with about 50% of their budget in carbon and ecosystems going to it, for precisely that reason, right? It's a big part of the planet, it's an important part of the planet, it's warming rapidly, and we don't really understand very well how things are changing, but we know things are changing. So that's kind of the motivation.